Martha's Lady, a short story by Orne Jewett. One day, many years ago, the old Judge Pine House wore an unwanted look of gaiety and youthfulness. The high-fenced green garden was bright with June flowers. Under the elms in the large, shady front yard, you might see some chairs placed near together, as they often used to be when the family were all at home and life was going on gaily with eager talk and pleasure-making, when the elder judge, the grandfather, used to quote that great author, Dr. Johnson, and say to his girls, "Be brisk, be splendid, and be public." One of the chairs had a crimson silk shawl thrown carelessly over its straight back, and a passer-by who looked in through the latticed gate between the tall gate-posts with their white urns might think that this piece of shining East Indian color was a huge red lily that had suddenly bloomed against the syringa bush. There were certain windows thrown wide open that were usually shut, and their curtains were blowing free in the light wind of a summer afternoon. It looked as if a large household had returned to the old house to fill the prim best rooms and find them full of cheer. It was evident to everyone in town that Miss Harriet Pyne, to use the village phrase, had company. She was the last of her family, and was by no means old. But being the last, and wanted to live with people much older than herself, she had formed all the habits of a serious elderly person. Ladies of her age, something past 30, often wore discreet caps in those days, especially if they were married. But being single, Miss Harriet clung to youth in this respect, making the one concession of keeping her waving chestnut hair as smooth and stiffly arranged as possible. She had been the dutiful companion of her father and mother in their latest years, all her elder brothers and sisters having married and gone, or died and gone, out of the old house. Now that she was left alone, it seemed quite the best thing, frankly, to accept the fact of age, and to turn more resolutely than ever to the companionship of duty and serious books. She was more serious and given to routine than her elders themselves, as sometimes happened when the daughters of New England gentlefolks were brought up wholly in the society of their elders. At 35, she had more reluctance than her mother to face an unforeseen occasion, certainly more than her grandmother, who had preserved some cheerful inheritance of gaiety and worldliness from colonial times. There was something about the look of the crimson silk shawl in the front yard to make one suspect that the sober customs of the best house in a quiet New England village were all being set at defiance, and once when the mistress of the house came to stand in her own doorway, she wore the pleased but somewhat apprehensive look of a guest. In these days, New England life held the necessity of much dignity and discretion of behavior. There was the truest hospitality and good cheer in all occasional festivities, but it was sometimes a self-conscious hospitality, followed by an inexorable return to asceticism both of diet and of behavior. Miss Harriet Pyne belonged to the very dullest days of New England, those which perhaps held the most priggishness for the learned professions, the most limited interpretation of the word evangelical, and the pettiest indifference to large things. The outbreak of a desire for larger religious freedom caused at first a most determined reaction toward formalism, especially in small and quiet villages like Ashford, intently busy with their own concerns. It was high time for a little leaven to begin its work, in this moment when the great impulses of the war for liberty had died away, and those of the coming war for patriotism and a new freedom had hardly yet begun. The dull interior, the changed life of the old house, whose former activities seemed to have fallen sound asleep, really typified these larger conditions, and a little leaven had made its easily recognized appearance in the shape of a light-hearted girl. She was Miss Harriet's young Boston cousin, Helena Vernon, who, half amused and half impatient at the unnecessary sober-mindedness of her hostess and of Ashford in general, had set herself to the difficult task of gaiety. Cousin Harriet looked on at a succession of ingenious and, on the whole, innocent attempts at pleasure, as she might have looked on at the frolics of a kitten who easily substitutes a ball of yarn for the uncertainties of a bird or a wind-blown leaf, and who may at any moment ravel the fringe of a sacred curtain tassel in preference to either. Helena, with her mischievous, appealing eyes, with her enchanting old songs and her guitar, seemed the more delightful and even reasonable because she was so kind to everybody, and because she was a beauty. She had the gift of most charming manners. There was all the unconscious lovely ease and grace that had come with the good breeding of her city home, where many pleasant people came and went. She had no fear, one had almost said no respect, of the individual, and she did not need to think of herself. Cousin Harriet turned cold with apprehension when she saw the minister coming in at the front gate, and wondered in agony if Martha were properly attired to go to the door, and would by any chance hear the knocker. It was Helena who, delighted to have anything happen, ran to the door to welcome the Reverend Mr. Crofton as if he were a congenial friend of her own age. She could behave with more or less propriety during the stately first visit, and even contrived to lighten it with modest mirth, and to extort the confession that the guest had a tenor voice, though sadly out of practice. But when the minister departed a little flattered, and hoping that he had not expressed himself too strongly for a pastor upon the poems of Emerson, and feeling the unusual stir of gallantry in his proper heart, it was Helena who caught the honored hat of the late Judge Pyne from its last resting place in the hall, and holding it securely in both hands, mimicked the minister's self-conscious entrance. She copied his pompous and anxious expression in the dim parlor in such delicious fashion that Miss Harriet, who could not always extinguish a ready spark of the original sin of humor, laughed aloud. "My dear," she exclaimed severely the next moment, "I am ashamed of your being so disrespectful," and then laughed again, and took the affecting old hat, and carried it back to its place. "I would not have had anyone else see you for the world," she said sorrowfully as she returned, feeling quite self-possessed again, to the parlor doorway. But Helena still sat in the minister's chair, with her small feet placed as his stiff boots had been, and a copy of his solemn expression before they came to speaking of Emerson and of the guitar. "I wish I had asked him if he would be so kind as to climb the cherry tree," said Helena, unbending a little at the discovery that her cousin would consent to laugh no more. "There are all those ripe cherries on the top branches. I can climb as high as he, but I can't reach far enough from the last branch that will bear me. The minister is so long and thin. I don't know what Mr. Crofton would have thought of you." "He is a very serious young man," said Cousin Harriet, still ashamed of her laughter. "Martha will get the cherries for you, or one of the men. I should not like to have Mr. Crofton think you were frivolous, a young lady of your opportunities." But Helena had escaped through the hall and out at the garden door at the mention of Martha's name. Miss Harriet Pyne sighed anxiously, and then smiled in spite of her deep convictions as she shut the blinds and tried to make the house look solemn again. The front door might be shut, but the garden door at the other end of the broad hall was wide open upon the large sunshiny garden, where the last of the red and white peonies and the golden lilies and the first of the tall blue larkspurs lent their colors in generous fashion. The straight box borders were all in fresh and shining green of their new leaves, and there was a fragrance of the old garden's inmost life and soul blowing from the honeysuckle blossoms on a long trellis. It was now late in the afternoon, and the sun was low behind great apple trees at the garden's end, which threw their shadows over the short turf of the bleaching green. The cherry tree stood at one side in full sunshine, and Miss Harriet, who presently came to the garden steps to watch like a hen at the water's edge, saw her cousin's pretty figure in its white dress of India muslin hurrying across the grass. She was accompanied by the tall, ungainly shape of Martha the new maid, who, dull and indifferent to everyone else, showed a surprising willingness and allegiance to the young guest. "Martha ought to be in the dining-room already, slow as she is. It wants but half an hour of tea-time," said Miss Harriet, as she turned and went into the shaded house. It was Martha's duty to wait at table, and there had been many trying scenes and defeated efforts toward her education. Martha was certainly very clumsy, and she seemed the clumsier because she had replaced her aunt, a most skillful person, who had but lately married a thriving farm and its prosperous owner. It must be confessed that Miss Harriet was a most bewildering instructor, and that her pupil's brain was easily confused and prone to blunders. The coming of Helena had been somewhat dreaded by reason of this incompetent service, but the guest took no notice of frowns or futile gestures at the first tea-table, except to establish friendly relations with Martha on her own account by a reassuring smile. They were about the same age, and next morning, before Cousin Harriet came down, Helena showed by a word and a quick touch the right way to do something that had gone wrong and been impossible to understand the night before. A moment later, the anxious mistress came in without suspicion, but Martha's eyes were as affectionate as a dog's, and there was a new look of hopefulness on her face. This dreaded guest was a friend after all, and not a foe come from proud Boston to confound her ignorance and patient efforts. The two young creatures, mistress and maid, were hurrying across the bleaching green. "I can't reach the ripest cherries," explained Helena politely, "and I think that Miss Pyne ought to send some to the minister. He has just made us a call. Why, Martha, you haven't been crying again." "Yes'm," said Martha sadly. "Miss Pyne always loves to send something to the minister," she acknowledged with interest, as if she did not wish to be asked to explain these latest tears. "We'll arrange some of the best cherries in a pretty dish. I'll show you how, and you shall carry them over to the parsonage after tea," said Helena cheerfully, and Martha accepted the embassy with pleasure. Life was beginning to hold moments of something like delight in the last few days. "You'll spoil your pretty dress, Miss Helena," Martha gave shy warning, and Miss Helena stood back and held up her skirts with unusual care, while the country girl in her heavy blue checked gingham began to climb the cherry tree like a boy. Down came the scarlet fruit like bright rain into the green grass. "Break some nice twigs with the cherries and leaves together. Oh, you're a duck, Martha." And Martha, flushed with delight and looking far more like a thin and solemn blue heron, came rustling down to earth again and gathered the spoils into her clean apron. That night at tea, during her handmaiden's temporary absence, Miss Harriet announced, as if by way of apology, that she thought Martha was beginning to understand something about her work. Her aunt was a treasure. She never had to be told anything twice. "But Martha has been as clumsy as a calf," said the precise mistress of the house. "I have been afraid sometimes that I never could teach her anything. I was quite ashamed to have you come just now and find me so unprepared to entertain a visitor." "Oh, Martha will learn fast enough because she cares so much," said the visitor eagerly. "I think she is a dear good girl. I do hope that she will never go away. I think she does things better every day, Cousin Harriet," added Helena pleadingly with all her kind young heart. The china closet door was open a little way, and Martha heard every word. From that moment she not only knew what love was like, but she knew love's dear ambitions. To have come from a stony hill farm and a bare, small wooden house was like a cave dweller's coming to make a permanent home in an art museum. Such had seemed the elaborateness and elegance of Miss Pyne's fashion of life, and Martha's simple brain was slow enough in its processes and recognitions. But with this sympathetic ally and defender, this exquisite Miss Helena who believed in her, all difficulties appeared to vanish. Later that evening, no longer homesick or hopeless, Martha returned from her polite errand to the minister, and stood with a sort of triumph before the two ladies, who were sitting in the front doorway, as if they were waiting for visitors, Helena still in her white muslin and red ribbons, and Miss Harriet in a thin black silk. Being happily self-forgetful in the greatness of the moment, Martha's manners were perfect, and she looked for once almost pretty, and quite as young as she was. The minister came to the door himself and returned his thanks. He said that cherries were always his favorite fruit, and he was much obliged to both Miss Pyne and Miss Vernon. "He kept me waiting a few minutes while he got this book ready to send to you, Miss Helena." "What are you saying, Martha? I have sent him nothing," exclaimed Miss Pyne, much astonished. "What does she mean, Helena?" "Only a few cherries," explained Helena. "I thought Mr. Crofton would like them after his afternoon of parish calls. Martha and I arranged them before tea, and I sent them with our compliments." "Oh, I am very glad you did," said Miss Harriet, wondering but much relieved. "I was afraid—" "No, it was none of my mischief," answered Helena daringly. "I did not think that Martha would be ready to go so soon. I should have shown you how pretty they looked among their green leaves. We put them in one of your best white dishes with the open work edge. Martha shall show you tomorrow. Mamma always likes to have them so." Helena's fingers were busy with the hard knot of a parcel. "See this, Cousin Harriet," she announced proudly, as Martha disappeared round the corner of the house, beaming with the pleasures of adventure and success. "Look, the minister has sent me a book. Sermons on what? Sermons. It is so dark that I can't quite see. It must be his sermons on the seriousness of life. "They are the only ones he has printed, I believe," said Miss Harriet with much pleasure. "They are considered very fine discourses. He pays you a great compliment, my dear. I feared that he noticed your girlish levity." "I behaved beautifully while he stayed," insisted Helena. "Ministers are only men." But she blushed with pleasure. It was certainly something to receive a book from its author, and such a tribute made her of more value to the whole reverent household. The minister was not only a man, but a bachelor, and Helena was at the age that best loves conquest. It was at any rate comfortable to be reinstated in Cousin Harriet's good graces. "Do ask the kind gentleman to tea. He needs a little cheering up," begged the siren in India muslin, as she laid the shiny black volume of sermons on the stone doorstep with an air of approval, but as if they had quite finished their mission. "Perhaps I shall, if Martha improves as much as she has within the last day or two," Miss Harriet promised hopefully. "It is something I always dread a little when I am all alone, but I think Mr. Crofton likes to come. He converses so elegantly." These were the days of long visits, before affectionate friends thought it quite worthwhile to take 100 miles' journey merely to dine or to pass a night in one another's houses. Helena lingered through the pleasant weeks of early summer, and departed unwillingly at last to join her family at the White Hills, where they had gone, like other households of high social station, to pass the month of August out of town. The happy-hearted young guest left many lamenting friends behind her, and promised each that she would come back again next year. She left the minister a rejected lover, as well as the preceptor of the academy, but with their pride unwounded, and it may have been with wider outlooks upon the world, and a less narrow sympathy both for their own work in life and for their neighbors' work and hindrances. Even Miss Harriet Pyne herself had lost some of the unnecessary provincialism and prejudice which had begun to harden a naturally good and open mind and affectionate heart. She was conscious of feeling younger and more free, and not so lonely. Nobody had ever been so gay, so fascinating, or so kind as Helena, so full of social resource, so simple and undemanding in her friendliness. The light of her young life cast no shadow on either young or old companions. Her pretty clothes never seemed to make other girls look dull or out of fashion. When she went away up the street in Miss Harriet's carriage to take the slow train toward Boston and the gaieties of the new Profile House, where her mother waited impatiently with a group of Southern friends, it seemed as if there would never be any more picnics or parties in Ashford, and as if society had nothing left to do but to grow old and get ready for winter. Martha came into Miss Helena's bedroom that last morning, and it was easy to see that she had been crying. She looked just as she did in that first sad week of homesickness and despair. All for love's sake, she had been learning to do many things, and to do them exactly right. Her eyes had grown quick to see the smallest chance for personal service. Nobody could be more humble and devoted. She looked years older than Helena, and wore already a touching air of caretaking. "You spoil me, you dear Martha," said Helena from the bed. "I don't know what they will say at home. I am so spoiled." Martha went on opening the blinds to let in the brightness of the summer morning, but she did not speak. "You are getting on splendidly, aren't you?" continued the little mistress. "You have tried so hard that you make me ashamed of myself. At first you crammed all the flowers together, and now you make them look beautiful. Last night Cousin Harriet was so pleased when the table was so charming, and I told her that you did everything yourself, every bit. Won't you keep the flowers fresh and pretty in the house until I come back? It's so much pleasanter for Miss Pyne. And you'll feed my little sparrows, won't you? They're growing so tame." "Oh, yes, Miss Helena." And Martha looked almost angry for a moment, then she burst into tears and covered her face with her apron. "I couldn't understand a single thing when I first came. I never had been anywhere to see anything, and Miss Pyne frightened me when she talked. It was you made me think I could ever learn. I wanted to keep the place. Count of Mother and the little boys were dreadful hard pushed. Hepsy has been good in the kitchen. She said she ought to have patience with me, for she was awkward herself when she first came." Helena laughed. She looked so pretty under the tasseled white curtains. "I dare say Hepsy tells the truth," she said. "I wish you had told me about your mother. When I come again, some day we'll drive up country, as you call it, to see her. Martha, I wish you would think of me sometimes after I go away." Won't you promise?" And the bright young face suddenly grew grave. "I have hard times myself. I don't always learn things that I ought to learn. I don't always put things straight. I wish you wouldn't forget me ever and would just believe in me. I think it does help more than anything." "I won't forget," said Martha slowly. "I shall think of you every day." She spoke almost with indifference, as if she had been asked to dust a room, but she turned aside quickly and pulled the little mat under the hot water jug quite out of its former straightness. Then she hastened away down the long white entry, weeping as she went. To lose out of sight the friend whom one has loved and lived to please is to lose joy out of life. But if love is true, there comes presently a higher joy of pleasing the ideal, that is to say, the perfect friend. The same old happiness is lifted to a higher level. As for Martha, the girl who stayed behind in Ashford, nobody's life could seem duller to those who could not understand. She was slow of step, and her eyes were almost always downcast as if intent upon incessant toil. But they startled you when she looked up, with their shining light. She was capable of the happiness of holding fast to a great sentiment, the ineffable satisfaction of trying to please one whom she truly loved. She never thought of trying to make other people pleased with herself. All she lived for was to do the best she could for others, and to conform to an ideal, which grew at last to be like a saint's vision, a heavenly figure painted upon the sky. On Sunday afternoons in summer, Martha sat by the window of her chamber, a low-storied little room, which looked into the side yard and the great branches of an elm tree. She never sat in the old wooden rocking-chair except on Sundays like this. It belonged to the day of rest and to happy meditation. She wore her plain black dress and a clean white apron and held in her lap a little wooden box with a brass ring on top for a handle. She was past 60 years of age and looked even older, but there was the same look on her face that it had sometimes worn in girlhood. She was the same Martha. Her hands were old-looking and work-worn, but her face still shone. It seemed like yesterday that Helena Vernon had gone away, and it was more than 40 years. War and peace had brought their changes and great anxieties. The face of the earth was furrowed by floods and fire. The faces of mistress and maid were furrowed by smiles and tears. And in the sky the stars shone on as if nothing had happened. The village of Ashford added a few pages to its unexciting history. The minister preached. The people listened. Now and then a funeral crept along the street, and now and then the bright face of a little child rose above the horizon of a family pew. Miss Harriet Pyne lived on in the large white house, which gained more and more distinction because it suffered no changes, save successive repaintings and a new railing about its stately roof. Miss Harriet herself had moved far beyond the uncertainties of an anxious youth. She had long ago made all her decisions and settled all necessary questions. Her scheme of life was as faultless as the miniature landscape of a Japanese garden and as easily kept in order. The only important change she would ever be capable of making was the final change to another and a better world, and for that nature itself would gently provide, and her own innocent life. Hardly any great social event had ruffled the easy current of life since Helena Vernon's marriage. To this Miss Pyne had gone, stately in appearance and carrying gifts of some old family silver which bore the Vernon crest, but not without some protest in her heart against the uncertainties of married life. Helena was so equal to a happy independence and even to the assistance of other lives grown strangely dependent upon her quick sympathies and instinctive decisions, that it was hard to let her sink her personality in the affairs of another. Yet a brilliant English match was not without its attractions to an old-fashioned gentlewoman like Miss Pyne, and Helena herself was amazingly happy. One day there had come a letter to Ashford in which her very heart seemed to beat with love and self-forgetfulness, to tell Cousin Harriet of such new happiness and high hope. "Tell Martha all that I say about my dear Jack," wrote the eager girl. "Please show my letter to Martha, and tell her that I shall come home next summer and bring the handsomest and best man in the world to Ashford. I have told him all about the dear house and the dear garden. There never was such a lad to reach for cherries with his 6'2". Miss Pyne, wondering a little, gave the letter to Martha, who took it deliberately, and as if she wondered too, and went away to read it slowly by herself. Martha cried over it and felt a strange sense of loss and pain. It hurt her heart a little to read about the cherry-picking. Her idol seemed to be less her own since she had become the idol of a stranger. She never had taken such a letter in her hands before, but love at last prevailed, since Miss Helena was happy, and she kissed the last page where her name was written, feeling overbold, and laid the envelope on Miss Pyne's secretary without a word. The most generous love cannot but long for reassurance, and Martha had the joy of being remembered. She was not forgotten when the day of the wedding drew near, but she never knew that Miss Helena had asked if Cousin Harriet would not bring Martha to town. She should like to have Martha there to see her married. "She would help about the flowers," wrote the happy girl. "I know she will like to come, and I'll ask Mamma to plan to have someone take her all about Boston and make her have a pleasant time after the hurry of the great day is over." Cousin Harriet thought it was very kind and exactly like Helena, but Martha would be out of her element. It was most imprudent and girlish to have thought of such a thing. Helena's mother would be far from wishing for any unnecessary guest just then in the busiest part of her household, and it was best not to speak of the invitation. Some day Martha should go to Boston if she did well, but not now. Helena did not forget to ask if Martha had come, and was astonished by the indifference of the answer. It was the first thing which reminded her that she was not a fairy princess having everything her own way in that last day before the wedding. She knew that Martha would have loved to be near, for she could not help understanding in that moment of her own happiness the love that was hidden in another heart. Next day this happy young princess, the bride, cut a piece of a great cake and put it into a pretty box that had held one of her wedding presents. With eager voices calling her, and all her friends about her, and her mother's face growing more and more wistful at the thought of parting, she still lingered and ran to take one or two trifles from her dressing table, a little mirror and some tiny scissors that Martha would remember, and one of the pretty handkerchiefs marked with her maiden name. These she put in the box, too. It was half a girlish freak and fancy, but she could not help trying to share her happiness, and Martha's life was so plain and dull. She whispered a message and put the little package into Cousin Harriet's hand for Martha as she said goodbye. She was very fond of Cousin Harriet. She smiled with a gleam of her old fun. Martha's puzzled look and tall, awkward figure seemed to stand suddenly before her eyes, as she promised to come again to Ashford. Impatient voices called to Helena. Her lover was at the door, and she hurried away, leaving her old home and her girlhood gladly. If she had only known it, as she kissed Cousin Harriet goodbye, they were never going to see each other again until they were old women. The first step that she took out of her father's house that day, married and full of hope and joy, was a step that led her away from the green elms of Boston Common, and away from her own country and those she loved best, to a brilliant, much varied foreign life, and to nearly all the sorrows and nearly all the joys that the heart of one woman could hold or know. On Sunday afternoons, Martha used to sit by the window in Ashford and hold the wooden box which a favorite young brother, who afterward died at sea, had made for her, and she used to take out of it the pretty little box with a gilded cover that had held the piece of wedding cake, and the small scissors, and the blurred bit of a mirror in its silver case. As for the handkerchief with the narrow lace edge, once in 2 or 3 years she sprinkled it as if it were a flower, and spread it out in the sun on the old bleaching green, and sat near by in the shrubbery to watch lest some bold robin or cherry bird should seize it and fly away. Miss Harriet Pyne was often congratulated upon the good fortune of having such a helper and friend as Martha. As time went on, this tall, gaunt woman, always thin, always slow, gained a dignity of behavior and simple affectionateness of look which suited the charm and dignity of the ancient house. She was unconsciously beautiful like a saint, like the picturesqueness of a lonely tree which lives to shelter unnumbered lives and to stand quietly in its place. There was such rustic homeliness and constancy belonging to her, such beautiful powers of apprehension, such reticence, such gentleness for those who were troubled or sick. All these gifts and graces Martha hid in her heart. She never joined the church because she thought she was not good enough, but life was such a passion and happiness of service that it was impossible not to be devout, and she was always in her humble place on Sundays, in the back pew next the door. She had been educated by a remembrance. Helena's young eyes forever looked at her reassuringly from a gay girlish face. Helena's sweet patience in teaching her own awkwardness could never be forgotten. "I owe everything to Miss Helena," said Martha, half aloud, as she sat alone by the window. She had said it to herself 1,000 times. When she looked in the little keepsake mirror, she always hoped to see some faint reflection of Helena Vernon, but there was only her own brown old New England face to look back at her wonderingly. Miss Pyne went less and less often to pay visits to her friends in Boston. There were very few friends left to come to Ashford and make long visits in the summer, and life grew more and more monotonous. Now and then there came news from across the sea and messages of remembrance, letters that were closely written on thin sheets of paper, and that spoke of lords and ladies, of great journeys, of the death of little children and the proud successes of boys at school, of the wedding of Helena Dysart's only daughter, but even that had happened years ago. These things seemed far away and vague, as if they belonged to a story and not to life itself. The true links with the past were quite different. There was the unvarying flock of ground sparrows that Helena had begun to feed. Every morning Martha scattered crumbs for them from the side doorsteps while Miss Pyne watched from the dining-room window, and they were counted and cherished year by year. Miss Pyne herself had many fixed habits, but little ideality or imagination, and so at last it was Martha who took thought for her mistress, and gave freedom to her own good taste. After a while, without anyone's observing the change, the everyday ways of doing things in the house came to be the stately ways that had once belonged only to the entertainment of guests. Happily, both mistress and maid seized all possible chances for hospitality, yet Miss Harriet nearly always sat alone at her exquisitely served table with its fresh flowers, and the beautiful old china which Martha handled so lovingly that there was no good excuse for keeping it hidden on closet shelves. Every year, when the old cherry trees were in fruit, Martha carried the round white Old English dish with a fretwork edge, full of pointed green leaves and scarlet cherries, to the minister, and his wife never quite understood why every year he blushed and looked so conscious of the pleasure, and thanked Martha as if he had received a very particular attention. There was no pretty suggestion toward the pursuit of the fine art of housekeeping in Martha's limited acquaintance with newspapers that she did not adopt. There was no refined old custom of the Pyne housekeeping that she consented to let go. And every day, as she had promised, she thought of Miss Helena. Oh, many times in every day. Whether this thing would please her, or that be likely to fall in with her fancy or ideas of fitness. As far as was possible, the rare news that reached Ashford through an occasional letter, or the talk of guests, was made part of Martha's own life, the history of her own heart. A worn old geography often stood open at the map of Europe on the light-stand in her room, and a little old-fashioned gilt button, set with a bit of glass like a ruby, that had broken and fallen from the trimming of one of Helena's dresses, was used to mark the city of her dwelling-place. In the changes of a diplomatic life, Martha followed her lady all about the map. Sometimes the button was at Paris, and sometimes at Madrid. Once, to her great anxiety, it remained long at St. Petersburg. For such a slow scholar, Martha was not unlearned at last, since everything about life in these foreign towns was of interest to her faithful heart. She satisfied her own mind as she threw crumbs to the tame sparrows. It was all part of the same thing and for the same affectionate reasons. Miss Harriet Pyne was often congratulated upon the good fortune of having such a helper and friend as Martha. As time went on, this tall, gaunt woman, always thin, always slow, gained a dignity of behavior and simple affectionateness of look which suited the charm and dignity of the ancient house. She was unconsciously beautiful like a saint, like the picturesqueness of a lonely tree which lives to shelter unnumbered lives and to stand quietly in its place. There was such rustic homeliness and constancy belonging to her, such beautiful powers of apprehension, such reticence, such gentleness for those who were troubled or sick. All these gifts and graces Martha hid in her heart. She never joined the church because she thought she was not good enough, but life was such a passion and happiness of service that it was impossible not to be devout, and she was always in her humble place on Sundays, in the back pew next the door. One Sunday afternoon in early summer, Miss Harriet Pyne came hurrying along the entry that led to Martha's room and called 2 or 3 times before its inhabitant could reach the door. Miss Harriet looked unusually cheerful and excited, and she held something in her hand. "Where are you, Martha?" she called again. "Come quick, I have something to tell you." "Here I am, Miss Pyne," said Martha. She wondered that she could speak as usual. There was such a ringing in her ears. "I shall have time to pick some fresh strawberries. Miss Helena is so fond of our strawberries." "Why, I had forgotten," said Miss Pyne, a little puzzled by something quite unusual in Martha's face. "We must expect to find Mrs. Dessart a good deal changed, Martha. It is a great many years since she was here. I have not seen her since her wedding, and she has had a great deal of trouble, poor girl. You had better open the parlor chamber, and make it ready before you go down." "It is all ready," said Martha. "I can carry some of those little sweetbriar roses upstairs before she comes." "Yes, you are always thoughtful," said Miss Pyne, with unwonted feeling. Presently the news gave wings to her willing feet. When Hannah, the cook, who never had known Miss Helena, went to the parlor an hour later on some errand to her old mistress, she discovered that this stranger guest must be a very important person. She had never seen the tea-table look exactly as it did that night, and in the parlor itself there were fresh blossoming boughs in the old East India jars, and lilies in the paneled hall, and flowers everywhere, as if there were some high festivity. Miss Pyne sat by the window watching, in her best dress, looking stately and calm. She seldom went out now, and it was almost time for the carriage. Martha was just coming in from the garden with the strawberries, and with more flowers in her apron. It was a bright, cool evening in June. The golden robins sang in the elms, and the sun was going down behind the apple trees at the foot of the garden. The beautiful old house stood wide open to the long-expected guest. "I think that I shall go down to the gate," said Miss Pyne, looking at Martha for approval. And Martha nodded, and they went together slowly down the broad front walk. There was a sound of horses and wheels on the roadside turf. Martha could not see it first. She stood back inside the gate behind the white lilac bushes as the carriage came. Miss Pyne was there. She was holding out both arms and taking a tired, bent little figure in black to her heart. "Oh, my Miss Helena is an old woman like me." And Martha gave a pitiful sob. She had never dreamed it would be like this. This was the one thing she could not bear. "Where are you, Martha?" called Miss Pyne. "Martha will bring these in. You have not forgotten my good Martha Helena?" Then Mrs. Dessart looked up and smiled, just as she used to smile in the old days. The young eyes were there still in the changed face, and Miss Helena had come. That night Martha waited in her lady's room just as she used, humble and silent, and went through with the old unforgotten loving services. The long years seemed like days. At last she lingered a moment, trying to think of something else that might be done. Then she was going silently away, but Helena called her back. She suddenly knew the whole story and could hardly speak. "Oh, my dear Martha," she cried, "won't you kiss me good night? Oh, Martha, have you remembered like this all these long years?" Oh, one pro, ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.